Okay, we are in 1 Samuel chapter 3, going verse by verse through this book. From Genesis is where we began. And I think we've made it pretty clear that the state of Israel was always pretty chaotic. They were constantly prone to wander and worship other gods, and especially before the exile, they had that problem of serving the Baals. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And that wasn't just the people, was it? It was also the priests. Eli was a priest who couldn't tell worship from drunkenness. His sons were so bad that God said, they're not going to be able to stay. He's going to kill them. That was the promise that he made in the last chapter there in chapter 2. God sent this man of God to Eli, and he said, here's what's going to happen. I'm going to kill them both. I'm going to take out your whole family. You're not going to keep your priesthood. All your descendants are going to die by the sword, and your sons are going to die together on the same day. But we also saw that God's not going to leave them leaderless. He's going to provide someone, and that was where this man Samuel came into play. Samuel did the duties of a priest. He was also a prophet and a judge. And he was very important because you have this era, this long era of silence before his time, and a new era comes in when Samuel begins to minister. Now, here's where I am on this. I've debated on how much of this to study and preach and what the main topic is. It's kind of some hard passages here. And it's easy to look at some of this and try to put words into it, well, this symbolizes this or whatever. But I like to stay away from that kind of stuff, and I want to just cover the main thing. When this was written to the people at the time, what did they hear? When they heard these words and filtered it through their own context, what was it that they understood? What was being said about God? That's the question. And so I want to try to keep that same focus as we study through it, and not impose our problems or our context or the way that we think things are or should be, but how was it then and what does it mean for us now? What's the timeless message here? I think to do that, we can't just read chapter 3, and really we can't just read chapter 4 or 5 or 6. We have to read 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. But I'm not saying I'm not going to go back and look at any of the other stuff. And some of these chapters are kind of short, and they're very interesting. It's a story that goes from one spot to the next. Each one is a chain building on this narrative of a very important time in Israel's history, and something that happened with Samuel. Before we get into it, I want to point out to you that the word ark, the Ark of the Covenant, is mentioned nearly 40 times in just these couple of passages. These 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. And the Ark is important, isn't it? What does the Ark symbolize? Anybody remember? You have the tabernacle, and inside of the tabernacle, in the very innermost part, you have the Holy of Holies, the most holy place, right? That was for the priest, the high priest, to go in there once a year to offer sacrifice on the Day of Atonement. Inside of the most holy place was, remember, the Ark of the Covenant. And that was, on top of the Ark of the Covenant, was the mercy seat, which is where the glory of God came down. So the Ark of the Covenant symbolizes God's presence with his people. This is like the communion piece here. The thing that, this is where God meets us. Okay, it's as close as you're going to get. But Israel lived in this time of silence and corruption. We're going to see here in the first couple of verses, the first verse, that there weren't frequent visions in that time. There was silence from God. And I want you to think about this, okay? They've got this tabernacle and this ark and everything for the communication they need with God and the covenant that they need. But they've also got this very idolatrous nation. They've got this sinful attitude. And I want you to keep in mind here the holiness of God, because that's really what's in question here. What is the holiness of God? Have any of you ever seen or read the Chronicles of Narnia? You know what I'm talking about? The C.S. Lewis books. It's an allegory. They made a movie about it a few years ago. And there's a question in there. There's a lion whose name is Aslan. And he's sort of allegorical to Christ. He makes a sacrifice, he raises from the dead and all this. But one of the kids in the story is asking about the lion, about Aslan. And he's kind of afraid, because, this is a lion we're about to meet. And so the question is, well, is he safe? And the answer to that is, no, he's not safe. He's not safe at all. He's very dangerous. And I think that's a great way to portray the holiness of God. No, God is not safe. It is a dreadful thing to fall into his hands. For us to say that there's no condemnation and we can approach the throne of grace with boldness is an enormous thing. God's not a buddy. He's not a chum. He's not one of us. He is dreadful, terrifying, fierce, vicious. And he's right there in the middle of Israel's camp. And they've built everything around him, and they're trying to get as close to him as they can. But they don't obey, and they don't do the things that he says. They don't respect his holiness, his separation, his distance from us. You know the verses like, his ways are not our ways, as high as the heavens are above the earth. Right? He's so much different than us. Time is different for him. A day is like 1,000 years. 1,000 years is like a day. He lives in inapproachable light. You can't even get close to him. I mean, the distinctions between God and us are vast. They're eternal. And here he is, right here. He says, I'm going to give you this ark and I'm going to live with you. I'm going to be in your presence. And so they're near this dreadful thing. They're very near this holiness. And because of their disobedience, they're sold into the hands of their enemies. And here in this chapter, we're going to see that they actually lose the ark. It gets stolen by their enemies. And these enemies try to set it up as their own religious shrine. They try to put it in with their own gods. And there's terrible trouble, terrible consequences for that. The Israelites get it back, and again, they don't respect the holiness, and a bunch more of them die. So the thing that we're dealing with here in 1 Samuel chapter 3 through chapter 7 is the holiness of God and the lack of respect, the lack of dread by the people who wanted to approach him. So the question that gets raised in regard to God's holiness they have to do with his leadership, with his authority, with his ability to be their God. What about the covenant? What about the law? What about his presence with us? And the way he answers those questions, the way he shows his holiness and demonstrates his ability and his authority to rule, is he raises up a faithful judge. He raises up a faithful prophet through Samuel. He reminds everybody of his power. You're going to see even hints of the Exodus as we study through here. The Exodus comes up. And I want you to think about that, this time of silence. How long was Israel in Egypt as slaves? 430 years, right? 400 something years. And do you think there was a lot of communication with God then? They didn't have anything. They were just waiting. And then finally God gets this prophet named Moses, and he speaks to him through a burning bush. So there was nothing but silence for all that time. And then think about it again. After Malachi, there weren't any prophets. There were no visions. It was silence from heaven for 400 years. And then Christ comes as the ultimate prophet, and he breaks the silence. Well, here we see this thing again. And there are parallels to the Exodus, to the breaking of silence through Moses, and parallels through the silence after the prophets in the intertestamental period there until Christ. We're going to see the same result that God delivers his people. So he raises up this judge. He reminds everybody of his power, hinting to the Exodus. A lot of people die in these chapters. A lot of them are made ill, very ill, to the point that they're deathly afraid because of the holiness of God. And a lot of people are brought to repentance. So we're going to study through this. 1 Samuel chapter 3 through 7. And we're going to look for the holiness of God and specifically the person of Christ and the gospel. So let's start the ESV, 1 Samuel chapter 3, verse 1. Now the boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord in the presence of Eli. And the word of the Lord was rare in those days. There was no frequent vision. At that time, Eli, whose eyesight had begun to grow dim so that he could not see, was lying down in his own place. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying in the temple of the Lord where the ark of God was. So I think this is one of the more important verses, and it's not because of the symbolism. I mean, you could say that Eli was spiritually blind, and he's also physically blind, and it was dark, but the light wasn't completely out. But I don't think those are the point. I don't think those things are the point of the story. I think the point of the story here is that there's presence despite the silence. God was still with them. He'd given them this tabernacle, and he'd given them this priesthood and everything they needed to be close to him. And he hasn't left. He's still there. And he's raising up this faithful priest, and he's bringing in this new era. Then the Lord called Samuel. This is the first time. And Samuel said, "Here I am." And he ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." But he said, "I didn't call you, so go lie down again." So he did. Verse 6, the Lord called again, Samuel. And he arose and went to Eli and said the same thing. And Eli replied the same way. Verse 7 says, "Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord, and the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him." So they're setting this up here. You need to understand that God is talking to Samuel, and he mistakes. He thinks it's Eli in maybe the next room, and he goes running over there, and he says, "Hey, I'm here. What's up?" "No, I didn't call you." Well, it was because he wasn't able to discern that yet. He didn't know the voice of the Lord when he heard it. So verse 8, the Lord called Samuel again the third time, and he went, and this time Eli perceived that the Lord was calling the boy. In verse 9, he said, "Go lie down, and if he calls you, you shall say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant hears.'" So Samuel went down to his place, and the Lord came and stood, calling as at other times, "Samuel, Samuel." And Samuel said, "Speak, for your servant hears." So 4 times God calls him. And I think that the most sure thing that we can say about it is that God is making his calling very clear. It's this time when there wasn't much being said. There was silence from God. And when God comes, they don't even recognize it's him until 3 times later. But when he does, there's no mistaking about it. God has called this man Samuel to help his people Israel in this dark time. So verse 11 says, "The Lord said to Samuel, 'Behold, I'm about to do a thing in Israel at which the ears of everyone who hears it will tingle. On that day I'll fulfill against Eli all that I've spoken concerning his house from beginning to end. And I declare to him that I'm about to punish his house forever for the iniquity that he knew, because his sons were blaspheming God and he did not restrain them. Therefore, I swear to the house of Eli that the iniquity of his house shall not be atoned for by sacrifice or offering forever.'" Of course, you remember what they were doing. They were taking the meat that didn't belong to them. They didn't let the people burn the fat off first. They were sleeping with the women who were helping in the temple. And it was blasphemy. And Eli was guilty because he didn't stop them. So he tells this to Samuel. And just put yourself in Samuel's shoes. Here's this kid. We don't know how old he was. He's probably not a little boy. Maybe a teen. young enough, he needs to keep his mouth shut. And God comes and he tells him the same thing that God had already told Eli. How about that for a first prophecy? I'm not even going to ease him into it. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take out the primary leadership of the nation. The guy who is your guardian. And you're going to go tell him. How do you think he felt about that? I mean, he can't fend for himself. He can't defend himself. He's going to be in big trouble if Eli doesn't take this the right way. If Eli decides to hold him accountable for it. But you see, Samuel is a prophet. Even before he knows it. I think about when Jeremiah was told, I knew you in the womb. I've stitched you together. I did this for my own purpose. You were called before you were born to do this thing. And Samuel's the exact same way. They blasphemed me. And so I have made you and put you in this place so that you can say what I want you to say. Well, Samuel lay until morning. And then he opened the doors of the house of the Lord, and he was afraid to tell the vision to Eli. But Eli called him and said, verse 17, what was it that he told you? Do not hide it from me. May God do so to you. May God, may you be cursed, basically. May bad things happen to you if you hide it from me. So, verse 18, Samuel told him everything and hid nothing. And Eli said, it is the Lord. Let him do what seems good to him. So, first chance, first opportunity. And he's a faithful prophet. He obeyed. He did exactly what God said, what God wanted, and he spoke the truth. And Eli seems pretty resigned to it. I don't know what he was actually thinking. They don't really tell us. But he's pretty old. And so I guess at this point he realizes there's nothing he can do. God, it's already been told to him once. Here's the second witness saying the exact same thing. He knows it's coming and there's nothing he can do. So Samuel passed that first test. Then verse 19. And Samuel grew, and the Lord was with him, and let none of his words fall to the ground, which is a way of saying that everything he said came true. Very important for a prophet, right? Because if a prophet said, thus says the Lord, and then that thing didn't happen, what was supposed to happen to the prophet? He's dead. But the Lord let none of his words fall to the ground. In other words, God told him, this is what I want you to say. And it was in little things too. You remember Saul, the one who'll become King Saul, he's looking for a donkey. And he goes and he says, hey, let's go ask this man Samuel and maybe he can tell us. And he did. So it was even little stuff like that. But whatever he said, it was found to be true. The Lord let none of his words fall to the ground. It was important that the voice of the Lord, the man who is responsible for proclaiming the word of the Lord, be trustworthy. And so none of his words fell to the ground. And all Israel, from the north to the south, knew that he was established as a prophet. And the Lord appeared again at Shiloh. Now think about this from the very beginning of the passage, that there was no vision at that time. At his time it was dark and silent. And now you've got God coming to him. He came 4 times and got his attention. And then at the end here, the Lord makes him speak the truth. And the Lord appeared again at Shiloh. It's this ushering in of an entirely new era. For the Lord revealed himself to Samuel at Shiloh by the word of the Lord. And again, it makes me think about Moses standing there in front of that bush. How the Lord revealed himself to him. During the darkest of times, God brings in a prophet to lead the people. So then we're going to fast forward. Okay? Samuel's established as a prophet. Now chapter 4. And the word of the Lord came, the word of Samuel came to all Israel. Now, Israel went out to battle against the Philistines. So here's the command. It's time to go to war. They go out and they encamped at a place called Ebenezer. We'll see where it gets its name in just a minute. It probably wasn't named Ebenezer at the time they went there the first time. And the Philistines encamped at Aphek. Now the Philistines drew up in line against Israel. And when the battle spread, Israel was defeated before the Philistines, who killed about 4,000 men on the field of battle. When the people came to the camp, The elders said, "Why has the Lord defeated us today before the Philistines? Let us bring the ark of the covenant of the Lord here from Shiloh, that it may come among us and save us from the power of our enemies." So the people went to Shiloh and brought from there the ark of the covenant of the Lord of hosts, who is enthroned on the cherubim. And the two sons of Eli, Hophni, and Phinehas were there with the ark of the covenant of God. As soon as the ark of the covenant of the Lord came into the camp, all Israel gave a mighty shout, so that the earth resounded. So you remember that Samson started this fight. Remember, the Philistines ruled over the Israelites because they had disobeyed. But it was God's will that they be eventually freed from the Philistines. And this isn't the end. They're going to have a long time of peace after this. But even David has to fight the Philistines later. So Samson started it, and here we're going to see it continued under Samuel. And it's what he tells them when we get down into chapter 7. He says, if you're returning to the Lord with all your heart, in other words, if you're ready to repent and you're serious about this, then put away the foreign gods, and He will deliver you out of the hand of the Philistines. So that's like the whole point. The whole objective here is to get out from under Philistine rule. But they were defeated. They get out there. And what are they going to do now? How are they going to get the Philistines under control? They say, how about this? How about we go get the ark? And it's kind of a crazy way to put it, that it may save us. And he goes to explain it even. He says, so they went and got the ark of the covenant of the Lord of hosts, who is enthroned on the cherubim. So they went and they got God's throne. They got the meeting place. And they said, we're going to take this over there and it's going to save us because it has supernatural power and we're going to be free of these Philistines once and for all. People see it coming into the camp and they let out this mighty cheer because they all believe it. They all know for sure, now that this has happened, we're going to be saved. Verse 6, when the Philistines heard the noise of the shouting, they said, what does this great shouting in the camp of the Hebrews mean? And when they learned that the ark of the Lord had come into the camp, they were afraid and said, a god has come into the camp. They said, woe to us, for nothing like this has happened before. Nothing that's happened to us before. Woe to us, who can deliver us from the power of these mighty gods? These are the gods who struck the Egyptians with every sort of plague in the wilderness. They knew about the Exodus. You would think from this, if they really knew about the Exodus and what happened to Pharaoh, that they would go ahead and go home. Call it off. We're going to ruin ourselves trying to do this. But instead, in verse 9, they say, take courage and be men, O Philistines, lest you become slaves to the Hebrews as they have been to you. You see the parallel with the Exodus? They're stuck as slaves in Egypt for all that time until God finally sends them a prophet. And they're saying, hey, this whole thing is going to turn around. Our slaves are going to become our masters if we don't take some courage here. So stand up, be men, and fight. So verse 10 says the Philistines fought, and Israel was defeated, and they fled every man to his home. They were done with this rebellion. And there was a very great slaughter, for 30,000 foot soldiers fell. And listen to this. The ark of God was captured. 7 times something like that gets said in these chapters. And the ark was captured. What do you think that did to Israelite society? When that was the very center of their identity and their strength and everything. Their law, the covenant, all of it centered around that right there, that God is right here with us. And now He's gone. and the two sons of Eli, both Hophni and Phinehas, died. So the people, they ask, well, why would God defeat us? Why would God defeat us? I know. He's not here on the battlefield. Let's go get him. Let's drag him out here, and then we're going to win this war. But there was some false hope in that, wasn't there? See, they were treating God like some magic trophy. We can have this relic with us. We can have this artifact with us. And as long as we have this, then we'll be okay. And what does that tell us about their attitude of the holiness of God? Who was God to them? He was reduced to a wooden box. And God is far too holy, far too much more to be reduced to that. What they should have done, like they had done before, is to say, well, why has God defeated us? Let's examine ourselves and let's repent of whatever sin we've committed and let's seek his wisdom on this. But they didn't do that. They said, why should you harden your hearts as the Egyptians and Pharaoh hardened their hearts? And then they did it. They hardened their hearts and they won, and the ark was lost, and the prophecy against Eli was fulfilled. Well, verse 12, a man of Benjamin ran from the battle line and came to Shiloh, which was like Jerusalem before Jerusalem was found, okay? He had torn clothes and dirt on his head. And when he arrived, Eli was sitting on his seat by the road watching. For his heart trembled for the ark of God. He didn't like it that they took it out. They got it out of the tabernacle and took it down there. And he was a little worried about that. And when the man came into the city and told the news, all the city cried out. And when Eli heard the sound of the outcry, he said, what is this uproar? His nightmare is coming true. He knows this is terrible. Then the man hurried and came and told Eli. Now Eli was 98 years old, and his eyes were set so that he could not see. And the man said, I've come from the battle and fled from there today. And he said, how did it go, my son? And he who brought the news answered and said, Israel has fled before the Philistines, and there has also been a great defeat among the people. Your two sons also, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead, and the ark of God has been captured. As soon as he mentioned the ark of God, Eli fell over backward from his seat by the side of the gate, and his neck was broken, and he died, for the man was old and heavy. The prophecy that God had predicted came true. Eli also died the same day as his two sons, and he had judged Israel 40 years. Now, keeping in mind the main topic, the main question, the holiness of God. What does it mean to Israel? What does it mean within the covenant? Verse 19, his daughter-in-law, the wife of his son Phinehas, was pregnant, about to give birth, and when she heard the news that the ark of God was captured, and that her father-in-law and her husband were dead, she bowed and gave birth, for her pains came upon her. And about the time of her death, the women attending her said, don't be afraid, for you've borne a son. But she did not answer or pay attention. And she named the child Ichabod, saying, the glory has departed from Israel. That is the meaning of that name. The glory has departed from Israel, because the ark of God has been captured, and because of her father-in-law and her husband. And she said, the glory has departed from Israel, for the ark has been captured. When she says that the glory of God has departed, she doesn't just mean that the shining radiance and all the blessings and wonderful things associated with it are gone. She means the presence of God is no longer with us. We live in a time where every man does what's right in his own eyes, and we live in a time where the priests robbed the people. But up to now, God has always been right here with us. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil. Why? Because you are with me. But now he's gone. The glory of the Lord, the dwelling place of the Lord, the meeting place has been moved. We no longer have access to him. And it's really the promise. It was what was promised, is that I'll be your God and you'll be my people if you obey. But they didn't obey. And the worst thing that could have happened to them happens. The ark is gone. The priests are gone. And Israel is all alone. But God's not done, is he? We know there's a lot more to come. Look at chapter 5. When the Philistines captured the ark of God, there it is again, they captured it. They brought it from Ebenezer to a place called Ashdod, and the Philistines took the ark and brought it into the house of Dagon and set it up beside him. So Dagon is their own god. And they're okay with Yahweh. I mean, Yahweh's powerful. Look what he did to the Egyptians. How good would it be for us if we continue to serve Dagon and we bring Yahweh in here too, and we go ahead and we serve and we love and we worship both of them? A lot to be said here about calling and election. They brought him into their temple. He didn't preach the gospel to them. He didn't send a prophet to tell them the truth or give them the right way. Look what he did. And when the people of Ashdod rose early the next day, behold, Dagon had fallen face downward on the ground before the ark of the Lord. So they took Dagon and put him back in his place. But when they rose early the next morning, behold, he had fallen face downward on the ground again, and the head and hands were lying cut off on the threshold. Only his trunk was left to him. This is why the priests of Dagon and all who enter into the house today don't tread on the threshold, to show respect for their God when he broke. Verse 6, the hand of the Lord was heavy against the people, and he terrified and afflicted them with tumors. And when the men of Ashdod saw how things were, they said, the ark of the God of Israel must not remain with us, for his hand is hard against us and against our God. So they want to bring this ark in. They want to claim the supernatural power for themselves, but they have no right to do it. They have no claim to this power, no claim to this worship, no claim to this God, and no means. They have no mediator. They have no priest. They have no prophet. They have no understanding. They have no covenant. They are excluded from these things. And so, God ravaged them with tumors, sores. We'll read in a minute that a lot of them died. And there also was maybe a plague of mice. You'll see that in a minute. He terrorized them. So, verse 8, they sent and gathered together all the lords of the Philistines and said, what shall we do with it? I mean, we can't just give it back. This is our trophy. We've won this. But it's killing us. So what are we going to do? And they said, let the ark of the God of Israel be brought around to Gath. Let's move it to a different place. Same, Goliath was from Gath, wasn't he? Philistine city. It still wasn't, they weren't giving it back to the Israelites. So they brought the ark of the God of Israel there. But after they brought it around, the hand of the Lord was against that city, causing a very great panic. And he afflicted the men of the city, both young and old, so that tumors broke out on them. So they sent the ark to Ekron. But as soon as it got close, the people cried out and said, they've brought it here to kill us. So, verse 11, they sent and gathered together all the lords of the Philistines and said, send away the ark and let it return to its own place. Let's stop trying to put it off on our own people. Let's just send it back to them. For there was a deathly panic throughout the whole city, for the hand of God was very heavy there, and the men who did not die were struck with tumors, and the cry of the city went up to heaven. Chapter 6. The ark of the Lord was in the country of the Philistines 7 months, and the Philistines called for the priests and the diviners and said, "What shall we do with the ark? Tell us, with what shall we send it to its place?" So they know they have to send it back because God's holiness is so great. It's a dreadful thing to even be in his presence. But they don't know how to send it back. You can't just carry it over there, right? So they called their priests and their diviners and said, "What do we do with it?" And they said, "If you send away the ark of the God of Israel, do not send it empty, but by all means return him a guilt offering. Then you will be healed, and it will be known to you why his hand does not turn away from you." So there was a question here over whether or not it was coincidence. We're going to see that in verse 9. Is this a coincidence that all this stuff's happening or not? And the priests are saying, no, it's not a coincidence. This is for real. You need to send it back. And when you do, you need to give them an offering at the same time, and that's going to fix your problem. And they said, verse 4, "What is the guilt offering that we should return to him?" And they answered, 5 golden tumors and 5 golden mice, according to the number of the lords of the Philistines. For the same plague was on all you and on all your lords. So they have to make an image, right? So what are the problems? Well, the problems are we've got these terrible sores. And I don't know what that looks like. I don't know what a tumor, I know what a tumor looks like. I don't know what a golden tumor looks like. But they made something to represent. Here's our problem, and here's the mice. These things are plaguing us. So we're going to offer you a golden version. And what we want is for you to take them away from us. So you must make images of your tumors, verse 5, and images of your mice that ravage the land, and give glory to the God of Israel. Perhaps he will lighten his hand from off you and your gods and your land. Why should you harden your hearts as the Egyptians and Pharaoh hardened their hearts? Why should you make it worse? Why should you not just give in now while you still have something left? After he dealt severely with them, did they not end up sending away the people anyway? They didn't get to keep the people. They didn't win the battle. They lost, and they spent everything doing it. Now then, take and prepare a new cart and 2 milk cows on which there's never come a yoke, and yoke the cows to the cart, but take their calves home away from them. So now this is the part about where they're showing that they might be coincidence. Here's how we're going to find out if God is doing this to us or if it's just something that's happening. You're not going to, no driver. Okay, you're going to build a cart with no driver, and you're going to put 2 milk cows. That is, cows that don't usually pull, right? These cows have never had a yoke on them, so they're not used to doing this. Plus, they've got babies. So there's no reason for these cows to go off and there's no reason for them to leave. There's no way for them to know where they're going. There's no reason for them to be experienced in pulling this thing. Make it hard. Let's see what happens. Take the ark of the Lord, verse 8, and place it on the cart and put it in a box. At its side, the figures of gold, which you're returning as a guilt offering. Then send it off and let it go its way, and watch. If it goes up on the way to its own land, to Beth Shemesh, which is a Levite city, then it is he who has done us this great harm. But if not, then we'll know that it's not his hand that struck us, and it happened by coincidence. So they did. They took the 2 cows and yoked them to the cart and shut up their calves at home, and they put the ark of the Lord on the cart with the box and the mice and the tumors, and the cows went straight ahead along one highway, lowing as they went. They turned neither to the right nor to the left, and the lords of the Philistines went after them as far as the border of the city. Now the people of that city, Beth Shemesh, were reaping their wheat harvest in the valley. You can picture all this. And when they lifted up their eyes and saw the ark, they rejoiced to see it. The cart came into the field of Joshua and stopped there. There was a great stone there, and they split up the wood of the cart and offered the cows as a burnt offering to the Lord. And the Levites took down the ark of the Lord and the box that was beside it, in which there was the golden figures, and set them upon the great stone. And the men offered burnt offerings and sacrifices on that day to the Lord. And when the 5 lords of the Philistines saw it, they knew, and they returned to Ekron. These are the golden tumors that the Philistines returned as a guilt offering to the Lord, one for Ashdod, Gaza, Ashkelon, Gath, and Ekron. And the golden mice were according to the number of all the cities of the Philistines belonging to the 5 lords, both fortified cities and unwalled villages. The great stone beside which they set down the ark of the Lord is a witness to this day in that field. So, people are out there working. I imagine it's on their minds. It's what everybody's thinking and wondering, what is going to happen to us in this dark time. And what? It just comes waltzing back into town. The Philistines can't believe it. This might be a coincidence, but those cows, as soon as they let them go, they just march straight on. This is definitely something that God is doing, and He's showing that He's not defeated. They bring Him into the Philistine temple or whatever where Dagon is, and God defeats their God. He comes right back in on His victory march. And so everybody's shouting, everybody's happy, but look, some bad news here, verse 19. And He struck some of the men of Beth Shemesh because they looked upon the ark of the Lord. He struck 70 of them, and the people mourned because of it. It was a great blow. Then the men said, "Who's able to stand before the Lord, this holy God, and to whom shall He go up away from us?" So they sent messengers to the inhabitants of Kiriath Jearim, saying, "The Philistines have returned the ark of the Lord. Come down and take it up to you." So here's the thing, okay? This city, the original city, Beth Shemesh, was a Levite city. Of all the people who knew what to do with the ark, and they knew how dangerous the presence of God was, it should have been the Levites, right? They knew the covenant. They knew the commands. They knew the way they were supposed to transport things. They knew what they were supposed to look at and not supposed to look at, touch and not touch. And they showed very little respect in their joy. You see, even when they were rejoicing about the return of the ark, they were still in great danger because the holiness of God is far greater than man. And they forgot. But God reminded them. And all of a sudden, all that celebration gets real sober and everybody has to come back down. And they holler at this other town, this, how do you say it? Kiriath Jearim. You know who that is? That's a Gibeonite town. You remember who the Gibeonites were? They were the people who tricked Joshua. They got some moldy bread and some worn out shoes, and they said, "Oh, we come from a long way off, and so we want to make a treaty with you." And the Israelites didn't ask God, and so they said, "Yeah, sure, let's make a treaty." Well, then they found out that they were actually next door neighbors, and they'd been tricked. So they said, "Well, we're going to keep our word. We're not going to kill you, but you're going to be slaves. You're going to carry our water." Well, the Philistines can't keep the ark because everybody's dying. The Israelites can't keep the ark because everybody's dying. And they say, "Hey, I know who can keep it. Send it over to the Gibeonites." So the men, chapter 7, came down and took it to the house of Abinadab. And they consecrated his son Eleazar to have charge of the ark. They set him apart. This is the lucky guy. From the day that the ark was lodged there, a long time passed, some 20 years. And all the house of Israel lamented after the Lord. And Samuel said to them, "If you are returning to the Lord with all your heart," so we have another fast forward, 20 years go by. "If you are repenting, if you are returning to the Lord with all your heart, then put away the foreign gods and the Ashtoreth from among you, and direct your heart to the Lord and serve Him only, and He will deliver you out of the hand of the Philistines." Now, there's a contrast here. What was their hope in the first battle that we read about? 20 years earlier, they fought a battle against the Philistines and lost it. What was their hope? Go get the ark, that it may save us. Here, Samuel tells them, if you want to win this battle against the Philistines, you have to return to the Lord with all your heart. So the people of Israel put away the false gods and served Yahweh only. And then he said, gather all Israel at Mizpah, and I will pray to the Lord for you. So they gathered there and drew water and poured it out before the Lord. And they fasted on that day. And they said there, we have sinned against the Lord. And Samuel judged them. So he says, you have to get rid of this idolatry and this mixed worship. Return to the Lord with all your heart, nothing else. And they did. Now, how do you think the Philistines felt about them gathering in large numbers near Philistine territory? Verse 7, when the Philistines heard that the people had gathered there, the Lord went up against them. And when the people of Israel heard it, they were afraid. And they said to Samuel, don't cease to cry out to the Lord our God for us, that he may save us from the hand of the Philistines. So, again, note the contrast between, hey, go grab the ark and let it save us, and what Samuel does. He took a nursing lamb and offered it as a whole burnt offering to the Lord. And he cried out to the Lord for Israel, and the Lord answered him. As Samuel was offering up the burnt offering, the Philistines drew near to attack, but the Lord thundered with a mighty sound that day against the Philistines and threw them into confusion, and they were defeated before Israel. And the men went out from Mizpah and pursued the Philistines and struck them down. Then Samuel took a stone and set it between Mizpah and Shin, and called its name Ebenezer. Ebenezer, it's 2 words. It means stone of help, helping stone. He said, till now the Lord has helped us. Here I raise mine Ebenezer, hither by thy help I've come. That's where that line comes from. This is the God of my help. The holy God who is so holy that we can't even when we're celebrating in joy, we can't touch the symbol of his presence. The God who is so dangerous and threatening and fearful. But when we return to him with all our hearts, he's on our side. He's our help. So the Philistines, verse 13, were subdued and did not again enter into the territory of Israel. And the hand of the Lord was against the Philistines all the days of Samuel. The cities that the Philistines had taken were restored. And Israel delivered their territory from the hand of the Philistines, and there was peace between Israel and the Amorites. And Samuel judged Israel all the days of his life, and he went on a circuit year by year to Bethel, Gilgal, and Mizpah, and he judged Israel in all these places. Then he would return home to Ramah and judge Israel there, and he built an altar to the Lord. I think the main purpose of this story, I think there are a couple of things that we can see, and I'll keep it short. Primarily, is that God's holiness is a dreadful thing. But to those who have returned to him with all their hearts, we have confidence in his help. When the New Testament says to fear the Lord, that fear is tempered by the fact that he's a father, that he calls us friend. But that fear is only tempered by the work of Christ. Who God is in relation to us is a terrifying thing. And when we preach the gospel, how belittling is it to preach a gospel that paints God as though He is impotent and unable to do His will? How insulting is it when the picture is painted of He's knocking and He's begging and He's pleading, but people just won't accept it? Isn't the gospel more like what we've read in Acts, where the people who stand against Him are judged? No question, no apology. Kiss the Son lest He be angry. But those who repent, those who change their minds about Jesus, are saved. And this stands in line with the holiness of God, with the dreadfulness of His character. That God saves because He chooses to save. Because He chooses to make a way. And not because of anything that we've done to manipulate Him. Not because of any deal that we've been able to offer. Not because of any goodness that we found in ourselves. But because we have heard His promise and responded to that. The second thing I see here is that God works His purpose despite our shortcomings, despite evil. There was nothing the Philistines could do to keep His presence out of Israel. There was nothing the priests could do to keep Him out of Israel. There was nothing the people could do. God promised men like Samuel that He would be with them and never forsake them. And He kept that promise because He's good. You see the gospel in these things? You see what Jesus has done for us despite evil? He is with us. And because of His holiness, He says, you will be holy because I am holy. We are separate from the world because He is. We are saved because of who He is. We are righteous because of who He is. And so we preach that gospel when we worship Him in it. Father, thank You for this story. Thank You for this message. God, may we see You in Your holiness and worship You in it. And may we preach this gospel, this good news, that those who believe it might be saved, return with all their hearts. In Your name we pray. Amen.